I still see that piece of paper sometimes when I close my eyes. It wasn't orders, it wasn't a map. It was a list of names, 17 names. Men I'd served with for 8 months. Good men, tired men. Men who'd survived Kasserine Pass when half our division didn't. The paper was pinned to the bulletin board outside the mess tent, and next to each name was a single word: transferred, demoted, reassigned, court-martialed. I stood there in the Moroccan dust reading those names over and over, and I remember thinking this wasn't the German army breaking us anymore. This was our own. It was March 1943. I was 20 years old. I'd been in North Africa for 4 months, and I'd already seen things I thought would be the worst of my life. Kasserine Pass taught us what real defeat felt like. We weren't ready for Rommel. We weren't ready for any of it. Our tanks burned like matches. Our boys ran. I ran too. I'm not proud of it, but I won't lie about it either. When those German tanks came through that pass with the 88s roaring and our Shermans exploding before they even got in range, we scattered like rabbits. The officers yelled. Some of them shot their pistols in the air trying to stop the retreat. It didn't matter. We'd been beaten and we knew it. Then Patton arrived. General George S. Patton Jr. I'd heard stories about him before I ever saw him. Everyone had. The man wore ivory-handled pistols and spoke like he was performing Shakespeare on a stage. But when he stepped out of that jeep at our camp outside Rabat, I wasn't thinking about his reputation. I was thinking about those 17 names, because that list went up the same day he took command of our corps, and everyone knew it wasn't coincidence. The first thing Patton did was make us look like soldiers again. That sounds simple. It wasn't. After Kasserine, we'd stopped caring about appearances. We wore what was comfortable. We saluted when we felt like it. We'd fought and lost and figured the rules didn't matter as much as survival. Patton saw it different. He saw a broken army that had forgotten what it was. So he gave us 3 days to fix ourselves or face charges. 3 days to find proper uniforms, polish boots we'd let turn brown with dust, shave faces we'd let grow scraggly, and remember that the US Army had standards even in the desert. I remember standing in formation that 3rd morning. The sun was already hot, even though it wasn't yet 7. Patton walked down the line with his aides behind him. He stopped in front of a sergeant from Pennsylvania. Good man. Fought hard at Kasserine. Carried a wounded private half a mile under fire. But he was wearing a tanker jacket that wasn't regulation for infantry, and his boots weren't laced right. Patton stared at him for maybe 10 seconds. Then he stripped the sergeant's stripes right there, told him he'd earned them back when he looked like a soldier who deserved them. The sergeant didn't say a word. None of us did. We just stood there sweating in the Moroccan heat, understanding that everything had changed. That was day 3. By day 5, Patton had relieved 4 company commanders. These weren't cowards. These weren't men who'd failed in combat. They were officers who'd lost control of their units after Kasserine. Men who'd let discipline slip because they felt sorry for their soldiers or because they were too tired themselves to enforce the standards. Patton didn't care about reasons. He cared about results. One of those commanders was Captain Morrison. He'd been our company CO for 9 months. Decent officer. Maybe too decent for what Patton wanted. Morrison had let us skip inspections after Kasserine. Said we'd earned rest. Said we needed time to recover. Patton said we needed to be soldiers again, and if Morrison couldn't make that happen, someone else would. The new captain arrived on day 6. Captain Hendricks. He was older, maybe 35. Veteran of the last war supposedly, though he never talked about it. First thing he did was order a full barracks inspection at midnight. Midnight. We thought he was joking. He wasn't. Anyone who failed the inspection pulled guard duty for a week straight. Half the company failed. I passed, but only barely. I'd spent 2 hours after dinner cleaning my rifle and pressing my uniform with a heated mess kit pan because we didn't have irons. That's what it took to meet the standard now. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The thing about Patton's 10 days wasn't just the discipline, it was the fear. We were more afraid of Patton than we'd been of the Germans at Kasserine, and that's the truth. With the Germans, you could at least predict what would happen. Artillery before dawn, tanks at first light, infantry following up. You knew the pattern. With Patton, you never knew. He'd show up at 4 in the morning demanding to inspect your rifle. He'd appear at the motor pool and personally check every vehicle's maintenance log. He'd walk through the mess tent, and if the cook hadn't shaved that morning, that cook would find himself assigned to a Graves registration unit by evening. It sounds harsh now. It was harsh then. But here's what I didn't understand at 20 years old, standing in that formation, watching sergeants lose their stripes. Patton wasn't being cruel for cruelty's sake. He was rebuilding us. We'd been shattered at Kasserine. Our confidence was gone. Our trust in our officers was gone. Our belief that we could stand up to the Germans was gone. Patton gave us something to replace it with. He gave us fear of failure, fear of not meeting the standard, fear of letting down the man next to you, because if you did, you'd answer to Patton, and that was worse than anything the enemy could do. Day 7 brought the exercises. Combat drills from before dawn until after dark. We practiced movements we'd screwed up at Kasserine. Tactical retreats done properly instead of the panic that had scattered us. Coordination between infantry and armor so our tanks wouldn't advance without support again. Artillery spotting so we'd actually know where to call fire missions. Everything we'd failed at, Patton made us do over and over until we could do it exhausted, in the dark, under simulated fire. He brought in tanks to drive past us with their engines roaring so we'd get used to the sound and stop flinching. He had engineers set off explosives randomly throughout the day so we'd stop ducking at every blast. I hated those drills. We all did. My feet bled through my socks from the marching. My shoulders went numb from carrying full combat load in the heat. I fell asleep during a 10-minute break and woke up to find my squad doing push-ups as punishment because one man resting meant the whole unit wasn't ready. That was another Patton rule. Individual failure was unit failure. If one man in your squad was late to formation, the entire squad ran laps. If one man's rifle was dirty at inspection, everyone stayed up cleaning weapons until every rifle passed. It forced us to watch each other, to care whether the guy next to you had his act together because his failure was your punishment. By day 8, we started to change. I can't explain exactly when it happened. Maybe it was gradual, maybe it was sudden, and I just didn't notice the moment. But we stopped looking like the beaten army that had retreated from Kasserine. We moved different, sharper. We stood different, straighter. When an officer gave an order, we jumped to it instead of shuffling along. Not because we suddenly loved the discipline, because we'd learned that hesitation meant consequences, and consequences meant more pain than just doing the job right the first time. Patton promoted men during those 10 days too. That's what people forget when they talk about his ruthlessness. He didn't just tear down, he built up. A corporal from Texas named Ramirez, who'd held his position at Kasserine when everyone else ran, got promoted to sergeant on day 8. Patton pinned the stripes on himself in front of the whole battalion. Told Ramirez he was the kind of soldier who made America's army the best in the world. Told the rest of us that if we wanted stripes, wanted promotions, wanted respect, we needed to earn it the way Ramirez had, by doing our jobs even when it was hard, by standing when others ran, by being the soldier our uniform demanded. I watched that promotion and something shifted in my head. Up until then, I'd seen Patton as this tyrant making our lives miserable for his own ego. But standing there watching Ramirez get recognized for courage at Kasserine, I understood what Patton was doing. He was showing us that the army still rewarded what mattered, that heroism counted, that doing your job well meant something. After a defeat like Kasserine, we'd started to think nothing we did mattered, that we were just bodies being thrown at the Germans until enough of us died, that they'd eventually run out of ammunition. Patton was teaching us we were more than that. Day 9 was the first time I felt ready to fight again. We did a full combat exercise, battalion strength, simulated German defenses, live artillery falling 100 yards ahead of our advance. We moved through that exercise like we'd been doing it for years. No confusion, no panic. When the artillery shifted, we advanced. When machine gun fire came from a bunker, we flanked it properly. When our tank support arrived, we coordinated instead of getting in each other's way. At the end of the exercise, Patton himself walked through our positions. He stopped at my foxhole, looked at how I'd positioned my rifle, looked at my ammunition laid out within easy reach, looked at the firing lanes I'd cleared. He nodded once and moved on. Didn't say a word, but that nod meant more than any speech could have. Day 10 was inspection, final inspection. Battalion formation in full combat gear. Every man, every weapon, every vehicle. Patton walked the entire formation. Took him 3 hours. He found faults. Of course he found faults, but they were small things now. A loose button, a spot of rust on a canteen, a bootlace that was frayed. Nothing like the disaster he'd found 10 days earlier. At the end, he stood in front of us and said something I've never forgotten. He said we were ready to kill Germans now. not ready to die for our country, ready to kill. That was the job. Make the other poor bastard die for his country. We'd forgotten that at Kasserine, thought the war was about enduring, about surviving. Patton reminded us it was about winning, and winning meant being more ruthless, more disciplined, more professional than the enemy. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. 3 weeks after Patton's 10 days, we went back into combat. Not against Rommel this time. The Desert Fox had retreated east. We faced what was left of the German Afrika Korps at a place called El Guettar. I remember the night before the battle. We were dug in on a ridge waiting for dawn. The air was cold. The desert always got cold at night, which surprised people who'd never been there. I was checking my ammunition for the 3rd time when Ramirez, now a sergeant, came by. He asked if I was scared. I told him yes. He said good, because men who weren't scared got killed fast. But fear was only useful if you could function through it. That was what Patton's 10 days had taught us. How to be afraid and still do the job. The Germans came at dawn like we knew they would. Tanks first. The Mark IVs that had torn through us at Kasserine. But this time we were ready. This time our anti-tank guns were positioned right. This time our artillery knew where to fire. This time we didn't run. I won't say we weren't scared. I was terrified. But when the order came to hold our position, we held it. When the order came to advance, we advanced. We moved like Patton had drilled us to move. We fought like he demanded we fight. And when it was over, the Germans retreated. We didn't. That was the difference. I killed my first man at El Guettar. I don't know his name. Don't know if he had family. Don't know anything about him except that he was young like me and wearing German gray. And he came around a knocked out tank right into my line of fire. I pulled the trigger because that's what you do. That's what Patton had trained us to do. React. Don't think. Don't hesitate. React and keep moving. The German went down and I kept advancing because stopping meant dying. And Patton had made that clear in every drill for 10 days straight. After El Guettar, people talked about Patton different. The men who'd cursed his name during those 10 days of hell started to understand what he'd done. He'd taken a broken army and made it functional again. Not perfect, not unbeatable, but functional, capable, ready to stand up to the Germans and give better than we got. Some men still hated him, thought he was too harsh, too demanding, too cruel. Maybe they were right. But we were alive and the Germans were retreating, and I had to wonder if we'd have survived another battle if Patton hadn't torn us apart and rebuilt us first. The 17 names on that list. I learned later what happened to most of them. Some got transferred to rear units and spent the rest of the war loading supplies. Some got demoted but stayed in combat, earned their ranks back eventually. A few got court-martialed and spent time in military prison. One, a lieutenant who'd abandoned his men at Kasserine, got sent home in disgrace. Patton didn't forgive that. Didn't matter if you were scared. Didn't matter if you thought the situation was hopeless. You stayed with your men or you answered for it. I saw Patton one more time after El Guettar. It was in Sicily, few months later. Different campaign, same war. He was inspecting troops before we pushed inland from the beaches. He walked past me in formation and I swear he paused for just a second. Maybe he remembered me from day 10 inspection. Maybe he didn't. Maybe I imagined the whole thing. But I stood a little straighter anyway, made sure my uniform was perfect, made sure my rifle was clean. Not because I was afraid of him anymore, because I didn't want to disappoint him. That was what those 10 days had done. They'd made us care about the standard, even when no one was watching. The thing about discipline is it's not about being mean. It's not about making people suffer for the sake of suffering. At least, that's not what Patton's discipline was about. It was about creating a framework that let you function when everything else fell apart. At Kasserine, when the Germans hit us, we had nothing to fall back on. No training that had prepared us for that intensity. No drills that had made the chaos feel manageable. No discipline that kept us together when every instinct said run. So we broke. Patton gave us something that wouldn't break. He made the standard so high, the expectations so rigid, that even when we were terrified and confused and taking casualties, we still knew what to do. We fell back on the training. We fell back on the discipline. We fell back on the framework he'd beaten into us for 10 days. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I've thought about those 10 days a lot over the years. 79 years now since Patton took command and turned our corps around. I've thought about whether it had to be that harsh, whether he could have rebuilt us without the fear, without the ruthless standards, without relieving good officers who just had one bad day at Kasserine? I don't know the answer. I'm 92 years old and I still don't know. What I do know is that we went into Guettar ready to fight and we came out winners. What I know is that men who would have died under our old leadership survived under the new standards. What I know is that I'm alive to tell this story. And there's a decent chance I wouldn't be if Patton hadn't done what he did. There's a story I heard later, never confirmed if it's true, but it sounds like Patton, so maybe it is. Someone asked him after the war whether he felt bad about how hard he'd been on the troops in North Africa, whether he regretted the harshness. He supposedly said he only regretted that he hadn't been harder, that every man who died later in the war because he wasn't properly trained, wasn't properly disciplined, wasn't properly prepared, that was on the officers who'd gone soft, who'd let standards slip because they wanted to be liked instead of respected. Patton didn't care about being liked. He cared about winning and bringing as many men home alive as possible. Those goals weren't always compatible with comfort. I think about that list of 17 names sometimes. Wonder what happened to those men after the war. Wonder if any of them understood why Patton did what he did. Wonder if they hated him until the day they died, or if eventually they came around to seeing it different. I ran into Morrison once, the captain who got relieved. It was 1952, Veterans Event in Philadelphia. We recognized each other across the room. He came over and we talked for maybe 20 minutes. I asked him if he was bitter about getting relieved. He said yes and no. Yes, because it felt unfair at the time. He'd done his best. His men loved him. But no, because he understood later that Patton was right. The men didn't need an officer they loved. They needed an officer who'd prepare them to survive. Love didn't stop German bullets. Training did. Discipline did. Standards did. Morrison told me something else that night in Philadelphia. He said he'd used what he learned from watching Patton in his civilian career after the war. He'd become a plant manager at a factory in Pittsburgh. When he took over, the place was a mess. Safety violations, production behind schedule, workers doing sloppy work because previous management had let things slide. Morrison said he thought about Patton's 10 days, about how Patton had come into a broken organization and fixed it not by being nice, but by being demanding. So Morrison did the same, set high standards, enforced them strictly, didn't accept excuses. Within 6 months, the plant was running better than it had in a decade. Workers hated him at first, same as we'd hated Patton, but eventually they took pride in their work again. Eventually, they appreciated that someone expected excellence from them. I don't know if that's a perfect comparison. Factory work and combat are different things, but the principle is the same. People need standards. They need to know what's expected. They need leaders who won't accept less than their best even when giving their best is hard. Patton understood that. He didn't baby us, didn't tell us we were doing fine when we weren't, didn't accept good enough when excellence was possible, and because he demanded so much, we gave more than we thought we could. The German tank commander at Guettar. I learned about him years later, reading a history book. His name was Kurt something, I forget the last name. He'd fought in Poland, in France, in Russia before coming to North Africa. Veteran of 3 years of war when I'd been in combat for less than 3 months. By all logic, his experience should have beaten our raw determination. But it didn't, because Patton had closed the experience gap in 10 days. He couldn't give us 3 years of combat in 10 days, but he could give us discipline, and discipline could substitute for experience in ways that mattered. That's what people don't understand about Patton's methods. They see the harshness and think it was about ego, think it was about Patton wanting to play the tough guy. It wasn't. It was about math, cold mathematics of war. An experienced army with poor discipline will eventually lose to a green army with excellent discipline, because the experienced army will get sloppy and the green army will do the fundamentals right. Patton knew this. He'd studied military history. He'd read about armies that won not because they were tougher or braver or better equipped, but because they were more professional. So he made us professional in 10 days. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. There was a private in my squad named Jenkins. Good kid from Iowa. Farm boy, strong as an ox, worked hard, but he couldn't keep his gear organized to save his life. Before Patton's 10 days, we just accepted that about Jenkins. That was how he was. After Patton took over, we couldn't accept it anymore because Jenkins's disorganization meant the whole squad got punished. So we helped him, taught him systems, checked his gear before inspections, made sure he was ready because his failure was our failure. Jenkins died in Italy in '44, took shrapnel from a mortar round, but before he died, he'd become a good soldier. Not because he changed fundamentally as a person, but because we'd made him change, because the standards demanded it, and because he'd become a good soldier, he'd saved lives. There was a firefight near Casino where Jenkins's squad automatic weapon kept the Germans pinned down long enough for the rest of us to flank them. He couldn't have done that if he'd stayed the disorganized farm kid he'd been before Patton's 10 days. That's the part that's hard to explain to people who weren't there. Patton's harshness saved lives, not in some abstract way, in concrete, specific ways. Men who would have died because their weapons jam survived because Patton had made us clean our weapons obsessively. Men who would have died because they didn't know how to move under fire survived because Patton had drilled us until the movements were automatic. Men who would have died because their units fell apart under pressure survived because Patton had built units that held together through punishment and shared suffering. I'm not saying Patton was a saint. He wasn't. He had a temper. He said things that were cruel. He slapped soldiers in Sicily who he thought were cowards, though later evidence suggested they were shell-shocked, suffering from what we'd now call PTSD. Patton got relieved for that, temporarily. Probably deserved it, but that doesn't erase what he accomplished in North Africa. Doesn't erase that he took a defeated army and made it functional in 10 days. The smell of the Moroccan camp during those 10 days. I can still recall it if I concentrate. Dust and canvas and gun oil and sweat. We were cleaning weapons constantly, so everything smelled like cosmoline and solvent. The chow was terrible, but we ate it anyway because Patton made surprise inspections of the mess tent, and if he found men not eating, he'd assume the food wasn't good enough and the cooks would pay for it. So we ate even when we weren't hungry, and the cooks actually started trying harder because they knew Patton might show up any moment demanding to taste what they'd made. Everything changed during those 10 days. The way we walked, the way we talked, the way we thought about ourselves. Before Kasserine, we'd been cocky. Americans, best country in the world, we'd roll through the Germans easy. Kasserine beat that out of us. We learned we could lose. We learned the Germans were good at what they did. We learned that confidence without competence got you killed. After Patton's 10 days, we had a different kind of confidence. Not cocky, earned. We'd worked for it. We'd met standards that seemed impossible. We'd proven to ourselves and each other that we could do hard things. That confidence carried us through the rest of North Africa, through Sicily, through Italy, for those of us who went that far. I left North Africa in late '43, got reassigned to a unit preparing for the invasion of France. Didn't serve under Patton again directly, though of course he was in France too, commanding armies while I was just a rifleman in the dirt. But the lessons from those 10 days stayed with me. When I trained new replacements in England before D-Day, I thought about Patton. I was strict. I was demanding. I didn't accept excuses. The replacements probably thought I was being an asshole. Maybe I was. But I was trying to keep them alive, and I knew from experience that nice officers got their men killed. Standards kept them alive. Landed at Normandy on D-Day +3. Different story, different horror. But I moved through those French hedgerows using tactics Patton had drilled into us. I kept my weapon clean even in the mud and rain. I worked with my squad as a unit instead of as individuals. I did what Patton had taught us to do, and it worked. Not always. Men still died. War kills even the best trained soldiers, but we were effective. We accomplished missions. We took objectives. We pushed the Germans back. And every time we did, I thought about those 10 days in Morocco. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The hardest part of Patton's 10 days wasn't the physical stuff, wasn't the marching or the drills or the lack of sleep. It was the mental weight of knowing you could lose everything you'd earned in an instant. One mistake and you'd lose rank. One failure and you'd be transferred out of your unit, away from men you'd served with, sent to some rear echelon job where you'd spend the war loading trucks. The uncertainty was exhausting. Not knowing when Patton might appear, not knowing what he'd inspect next, not knowing if today would be the day you screwed up and paid for it. But that uncertainty also kept us sharp. We couldn't relax, couldn't get comfortable, couldn't assume we'd met the standard just because we'd met it yesterday. Every day was a new test. Every formation was a potential disaster. Every inspection was another chance to fail. And because we could never relax, we stayed at peak performance. That was exhausting, but it was also exactly what Patton intended. He was training us for combat, and combat is exhausting. Combat is uncertainty. Combat is knowing that one mistake might kill you or get your friends killed. By making those 10 days feel like combat, Patton was preparing us for what was coming. There was a staff sergeant who'd been in the regular army since before the war, career soldier. He'd served in the Philippines, in Panama, seen a lot. He told me once during a rare break that he'd never experienced anything like Patton's takeover. Said it was the most intense period of his entire military career, and he'd been in for almost 15 years at that point. Said Patton was either a genius or insane, and he couldn't figure out which. I asked him if it was working, if he thought Patton was fixing the problems from Kasserine. He said yes, absolutely. But the question was whether we'd hold together or break under the pressure. Some units break when you push them too hard. They don't become stronger, they fracture. Patton was gambling that we'd become stronger. The gamble paid off. We didn't break. We got harder. We got better. And when we went back into combat, we proved that Patton's methods worked. Guettar wasn't our only success. We pushed the Germans back across North Africa, took thousands of prisoners, destroyed dozens of tanks, captured supply depots. All the things we'd failed to do at Kasserine, we did after Patton rebuilt us. And then we took those lessons to Sicily, and Sicily fell. Took them to Italy, and Italy fell. Took them to France, and France was liberated. Patton's 10 days rippled through the entire war. I don't want to give the impression that Patton personally won the war. He didn't. Thousands of officers and millions of soldiers won the war, along with our allies. But Patton's contribution in North Africa was critical. If he hadn't rebuilt us after Kasserine, if we'd stayed broken, the Germans might have held North Africa longer, might have reinforced, might have turned it into a stalemate. Instead, Patton gave us momentum, gave us confidence, gave us the tools to win, and winning in North Africa opened the path to Sicily and Italy and eventually France. The dominoes fell because Patton had straightened out that first domino. After the war, I went back to civilian life like most of us did. Got a job, got married, had kids. Tried not to think about the war too much. But sometimes I'd be at work and face a hard problem, and I'd think about those 10 days. About how Patton had taken an impossible situation and fixed it through sheer force of will and uncompromising standards. And I'd realize that I could do the same in my small way. When I was raising my kids and they wanted to quit something because it was hard, I thought about Patton. Didn't let them quit, made them see it through, made them learn that hard things are worth doing, that standards matter, that doing your best isn't just a nice idea, but a requirement. My son asked me once when he was maybe 15 why I was so strict, why I demanded so much from him and his sisters, why I wouldn't accept less than their best effort. I didn't have a good answer at the time, just told him that's how I was raised, which wasn't really true. My father had been pretty easygoing, but later I realized the real answer. I was strict because Patton had shown me that high standards save lives. Not literally in civilian life, but metaphorically. High standards keep you from wasting your potential, keep you from settling for good enough when excellence is possible, keep you from becoming less than you could be. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. That piece of paper with 17 names, I wish I'd kept it. Wish I'd thought to take it down from the bulletin board and save it. It would be in a museum now, probably. Or at least in a box in my attic where my grandkids could find it after I'm gone and wonder what it meant. But I didn't think to save it. I was 20 years old and couldn't imagine living to 92. Couldn't imagine caring about preserving history because I was too busy living it. So the paper stayed on the bulletin board until someone took it down and threw it away, and those 17 names were lost except in memories like mine. I wonder sometimes what those 17 men would say about Patton's 10 days if they were still alive. Would they admit he was right to relieve them, to demote them, to reassign them? Or would they carry resentment into their graves? Would they understand that Patton was trying to save the army, even if it meant sacrificing their careers? Or would they just remember the humiliation and shame? I don't know. I can't know. I only know my perspective, and my perspective is that Patton did what needed doing even though it was hard, even though it was harsh, even though it made him unpopular. He did the job. That's leadership, I think. Real leadership. Not making people like you, not making people comfortable, making people better, making organizations functional, making hard decisions that hurt in the short term but help in the long term. Patton was a leader, flawed, certainly, cruel at times, but a leader who got results when results mattered most. The German prisoners we took after Guettar. I saw some of them being marched to the rear. They looked defeated. Not just militarily defeated, but spiritually defeated. They'd thought they were the best army in the world. They'd beaten everyone they'd fought for 3 years. Then they met us after Patton had rebuilt us, and we beat them. You could see it in their faces. The shock, the confusion. How had the Americans who'd run at Kasserine turned into soldiers who could stand and fight and win? They didn't know about the 10 days, didn't know about Patton's transformation of our corps. They just knew something had changed, and the change had cost them the battle. I felt pride that day. First time I'd felt real pride since joining the army. At boot camp, I'd felt excited. At Kasserine, I'd felt shame. But after Guettar, watching those German prisoners marching past, knowing we'd beaten them fair and square, I felt pride. Pride in my unit, pride in my training, pride in what Patton had made us. That pride carried me through the rest of the war. When things got hard in France, when I was cold and wet and scared and wanted to quit, I remembered that I was part of an army that had been broken and rebuilt itself in 10 days. If we could do that, we could do anything. Ramirez died in France. The sergeant who Patton had promoted, who'd stood at Kasserine when others ran. He took a sniper round near Saint-Lô in July '44. We buried him in a temporary cemetery that eventually became one of those beautiful American military cemeteries you can visit today. I went back in 2002, walked through the rows of white crosses until I found his, stood there for a while thinking about Patton pinning those sergeant stripes on him in Morocco, thinking about how proud Ramirez had been, how he'd earned that rank through courage, and how he died still being the kind of soldier Patton had recognized, the kind who stood when others ran, the kind who did the hard thing because it was right. I'm 92 now. Most of the men I served with are gone. Most of the men who went through Patton's 10 days are gone. Soon we'll all be gone, and these memories will be just words in books and interviews and videos like this. That's why I'm telling this story, not because I think I'm special. I'm not. I was just a private, then a PFC, then a corporal. Never went higher than that. Never wanted to. But I was there for something important. I was there when Patton took a broken army and fixed it in 10 days. I saw it happen. I lived it. And before I die, I wanted to make sure someone knew what it was really like. The history books make it sound clean. They say Patton took command, implemented strict discipline, and restored the unit's combat effectiveness. That's all true, but it doesn't capture what it felt like. Doesn't capture the fear, the exhaustion, the anger, the gradual realization that the harsh treatment was making us better. Doesn't capture the moment when you suddenly understood that you were part of something bigger than yourself. That you were part of an army that refused to stay defeated. That you were part of a machine Patton was rebuilding one piece at a time, and you were one of those pieces. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I've carried these memories for 79 years now. Carried them through the rest of the war, through civilian life, through marriage and kids and grandkids, and now great-grandkids. Carried them through all the moments when I had to make hard decisions and wondered if I was being too harsh like Patton or not harsh enough. Carried them through times when I wanted to give up and remembered that giving up wasn't something Continuar 0849 Patton soldiers did. The 10 days shaped me in ways I didn't understand at 20 and barely understand now at 92. What I learned from those 10 days wasn't just military tactics. It was that transformation is possible, that broken things can be fixed if someone is willing to do the hard work of fixing them, that standards matter more than comfort. That discipline, real discipline, isn't about punishment, but about creating a framework that lets you succeed when circumstances are against you. That leadership means making unpopular decisions if those decisions are right. That sometimes you have to be hard on people because being soft gets them killed. These aren't lessons everyone would agree with. We live in different times now. The military is different. Society is different. Maybe Patton's methods wouldn't work today. Maybe they'd be seen as too harsh, too uncompromising, too harsh. Maybe modern soldiers need different motivation than fear and pride. I don't know. I'm an old man from a different era talking about things that happened when most people alive today weren't even born yet. But I know what worked in 1943. I know what took us from defeat to victory in 10 days. And I know that I'm alive at 92, partly because Patton demanded excellence when excellence seemed impossible. That piece of paper with 17 names. I still see it when I close my eyes. Still remember standing in the Moroccan dust reading those names and understanding that everything had changed. We weren't the army that lost at Kasserine anymore. We were Patton's army now. And Patton's army didn't lose. It couldn't afford to lose. The standards were too high. The expectations were too rigid. The discipline was too ingrained. We'd been rebuilt from broken pieces into something functional and lethal and professional. And that transformation started with a piece of paper and 17 names, and a general who understood that fixing an army sometimes meant being ruthless with the men you were trying to save. I don't know if Patton would be proud of me telling this story. Probably not. He didn't care much about individual soldiers' memories. He cared about results, about winning, about accomplishing the mission. But I'm telling it anyway, because someone should remember those 10 days not as a footnote in military history, but as what it was: a crucible, a transformation, a moment when everything hung in the balance and one man's uncompromising demand for excellence tipped the scales. The cost of those 10 days was high. Men's careers ended, pride was shattered, friendships were strained. Some men never forgave Patton. Some men went to their graves bitter about how they were treated. That's the truth too. It wasn't all glory and success and proud memories. Some men were broken in different ways by Patton's methods. Some men never recovered from the humiliation of being relieved or demoted or court-martialed. War is complicated that way. The things that save some people destroy others. The methods that work for the majority crush the minority. I can't resolve that. I can only tell what I saw and experienced and understood. What I understood at the time was limited. I was 20 and scared and trying to survive. What I understand now at 92 is broader, but still incomplete. I understand that Patton probably saved my life by making me a better soldier. I understand that his harshness had a purpose. I understand that sometimes love means discipline rather than comfort. But I also understand that I can't speak for the 17 names on that paper. Can't speak for the men who were broken rather than hardened by those 10 days. Can't speak for everyone who went through what I went through. I can only speak for myself. And for myself, I say this: Patton's 10 days were the hardest, most important period of my military service. They taught me things I needed to know to survive the war. They made me part of something larger than myself. They showed me what I was capable of when someone demanded more than I thought I could give. They were harsh and exhausting and sometimes cruel, but they worked. And decades later, when I think about what made me who I am, those 10 days are near the top of the list. So that piece of paper with 17 names, it represents what Patton did to all of us. Not just those 17. He put everyone's name on a metaphorical list. Everyone's career, everyone's pride, everyone's sense of self was on that bulletin board, and Patton was evaluating us all to see who measured up and who didn't. Most of us measured up, eventually, some didn't. But we all knew we were being evaluated constantly, and that knowledge changed how we acted, changed how we thought, changed who we were. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I'm 92 years old now, and I'm finally telling this story because the men who could contradict me are mostly gone. The men who could say I'm remembering it wrong or leaving out important parts or making Patton sound better than he was, they're gone. It's just us old men now, fewer every year, carrying memories of a war that shaped the world. And before I go, I wanted to make sure someone heard about those 10 days, about what it was like to be broken and rebuilt, about what it cost and what it accomplished, about the piece of paper with 17 names that I still see when I close my eyes 79 years later. Maybe this story doesn't have a clean ending. Real stories rarely do. The war continued after those 10 days. Men died. Battles were won and lost. Patton himself died in a car accident after the war ended. Never got to grow old like I did. The army moved on. The world moved on. But for those of us who were there, who went through that crucible in the Moroccan desert in March 1943, those 10 days marked us forever, changed us, made us into something different than what we'd been. And whether that change was worth the cost, whether Patton's methods were justified by the results, those are questions I'm still working through at 92 years old. What I know for certain is this: I'm alive, made it through the war, made it through 79 years after the war, raised a family, lived a life. And somewhere in the foundation of that life is those 10 days when Patton taught me that I was capable of more than I thought, that standards matter, that discipline is a gift rather than a punishment, that being hard on people can be an act of love if it prepares them for what's coming. Those lessons have served me well, served my family well, served everyone I've worked with or led or taught over the decades. So I'm grateful for those 10 days, even though they were hard. Grateful for Patton even though he was harsh. Grateful for the discipline even though it hurt. Grateful for the standards even though they seemed impossible to meet. Because meeting those standards taught me that impossible just means difficult. That with enough effort and enough commitment and enough refusal to accept less than your best, impossible becomes possible. And that lesson, learned in the Moroccan desert under the command of a general who refused to accept defeat, that lesson has lasted a lifetime. That piece of paper, 17 names, I still see it, still remember, still carry it with me even though the physical paper is long gone. It represents a moment when everything changed, when a defeated army started becoming a winning army, when boys started becoming soldiers, when standards started mattering again after they'd been forgotten in the chaos of defeat. It represents Patton's 10 days, and those days represent something larger. They represent the idea that broken things can be fixed, that defeat doesn't have to be final, that with leadership and discipline and uncompromising standards, transformation is possible. I'm 92 years old, and these are my memories of the time Patton's ruthless discipline rebuilt a broken army in 10 days. Not the sanitized version from history books, not the Hollywood version with dramatic music and inspiring speeches. The real version, as I lived it, harsh and exhausting and transformative and necessary. The version where men's careers ended so other men could survive, where pride was shattered so discipline could be built, where comfort was sacrificed so competence could emerge. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't always fair, but it worked, and that's what mattered then. That's what still matters now as I tell this story one more time before there's no one left who remembers what it was really like. Pod continuar com o rotero. Euro 851, the German soldier I killed at El Guettar. I've thought about him more as I've gotten older than I did in the years right after the war. When you're young, you can push those things aside. Tell yourself it was war, it was necessary, it was him or me. All of that is true. But at 92, with more years behind me than ahead, I think about that young man more often. Wonder what his name was. Wonder if his mother waited for a letter that never came. Wonder if he had a girl back home who married someone else eventually. Wonder if he'd gone through his own version of Patton's 10 days. Some German officer screaming at him to be harder, better, more disciplined. War makes you do things you carry forever. Patton understood that. He never pretended war was noble or clean. He just insisted it be done professionally. That if you're going to fight, you fight to win. That if you're going to kill, you do it efficiently rather than clumsily. That if men are going to die, they should die accomplishing something rather than dying for nothing because their unit was poorly trained and poorly led. That was Patton's philosophy stripped down to basics. Win, survive. Make the enemy die instead of your friends. Everything else was secondary. The night before El Guettar, I wrote a letter home. Told my mother I was fine, which was a lie. Told her not to worry, which was pointless because mothers always worry. Told her the war would be over soon, which I believed at the time even though it took 2 more years. I didn't tell her about Kasserine. Didn't tell her about Patton's 10 days. Didn't tell her I was terrified of going back into combat. The censors would have cut it out anyway, but more than that, I didn't want her to know. Didn't want her carrying my fear along with her own. So I lied, like soldiers have always lied to the people who love them, and I sealed the letter and hoped she'd get it before she got any other kind of notification. That letter made it home. I know because she kept it, and after she died in 1967, I found it in a box with all the letters I'd sent during the war. Reading it decades later was strange. The handwriting was mine, but the person who wrote it felt like someone else. A boy trying to sound brave, a boy trying to protect his mother from the truth, a boy who didn't yet know what Patton's 10 days would turn him into. The letter was dated March 18, 1943, 2 days before El Guettar, 2 days before I killed my first man, 2 days before I stopped being a boy who talked about war and became a man who'd actually fought in one. Patton never asked us to write letters home, never gave inspiring speeches about mothers and apple pie and the American way. That wasn't his style. His speeches were about killing Germans efficiently, about not dying stupidly, about doing your job so well that the enemy never had a chance. Some officers tried to motivate with patriotism. Patton motivated with professionalism and fear. Fear of failing, fear of letting down your unit, fear of being the weak link that got everyone killed. It worked better than patriotic speeches would have, at least for us. At least after Kasserine had shown us what real combat looked like. The moment I knew we'd changed, that Patton's 10 days had actually worked, came during that first exchange of fire at Guettar. The Germans opened up with machine guns from a ridge about 300 yards away. At Kasserine, that would have sent us diving for cover and staying there. At Guettar, we dove for cover, sure, that's just survival instinct, but then we returned fire, coordinated fire, suppressing fire while one squad moved to flank. Exactly like we drilled for 10 days straight. No one panicked, no one ran. We just did what we'd been trained to do, and it worked. The Germans withdrew from that position and we advanced. Simple as that. Training and discipline beat experience and aggression. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. Captain Hendricks, the officer who'd replaced Morrison, he got hit at Guettar. Not killed, but wounded bad enough to be evacuated. Took shrapnel from a mortar round in his left leg and shoulder. I saw him being carried to the aid station. He was conscious, in pain, but he was giving orders right up until they loaded him on the truck, telling his lieutenant what to do, where to position the men, how to handle the German counterattack everyone knew was coming. That was Patton's influence too. The idea that you stayed professional even when you were bleeding, even when you were scared, even when every instinct said, think about yourself, you thought about the mission first. I never saw Hendricks again after that day. Don't know if he recovered and went back to combat or if his wounds ended his war. Don't know if he survived to go home or if complications killed him later. The war was like that. People came into your life, changed it, then disappeared, and you never knew what happened to them. Hendricks had been our captain for maybe 3 weeks total, but in those 3 weeks he'd implemented Patton's standards so strictly that the company transformed. And then he was gone, but the transformation remained. The replacements who joined us after Guettar didn't understand what they were walking into. They'd been through basic training. They'd been through some additional training in Morocco, but they hadn't been through Patton's 10 days, hadn't been broken at Kasserine and rebuilt. They showed up thinking they knew what to expect, and we had to teach them all over again. Not the same way Patton had taught us. We didn't have his authority or his ruthlessness, but we taught them the standards, showed them how to maintain their weapons properly, showed them how to move under fire, showed them what was expected of a soldier in Patton's corps, even if Patton himself wasn't directly commanding us anymore. One replacement kid from Chicago named Tommy Chen, he complained about the weapon cleaning standards, said we were being too picky, said his rifle was clean enough. I took him aside and told him about Kasserine, told him how men had died because their weapons jammed, told him that clean enough wasn't good enough, and if he wanted to survive, he'd learn that fast. He got angry, thought I was being an asshole. Maybe I was. But 2 weeks later, his rifle saved his life because it didn't jam when a German came around a corner right in front of him. After that, Tommy cleaned his weapon obsessively, never complained again. Taught the next batch of replacements the same lesson I taught him. That's how Patton's standards spread. Not just through official channels, but through the veterans teaching the new guys. Through experience proving that the standards weren't arbitrary, but necessary. Through men learning the hard way that discipline kept you alive. It became part of the culture of units that had served under Patton. Even after we were transferred to different commands, even after we were scattered across different theaters, we carried those lessons with us. The second time I killed someone was different from the first, more deliberate. We were clearing a village in Sicily, months after Guettar. Going house to house, dangerous, close quarters work. I kicked in a door and there was a German soldier inside, young like me, and we both froze for maybe half a second. Both surprised, both scared. But my training kicked in faster than his. I fired first. He went down. I moved on to clear the rest of the house. The whole thing took maybe 5 seconds. Only later, when the village was secure and we were regrouping, did I think about it. About how I'd killed a man in his own space, in a house he'd probably been ordered to defend. About how Patton's training had made me faster, more efficient, more lethal. About whether that was something to be proud of or ashamed of. I'm still not sure. At 92, I'm still working through what it means that I was good at killing, that the training worked, that I survived partly because I was better at the job of war than the men I faced. Patton would say that's exactly right. That's the goal. Make yourself so good at war that the enemy doesn't stand a chance. And strategically, militarily, that makes sense. But morally, spiritually, it's more complicated. The German soldier in that Sicilian house, he was someone's son, someone's brother, maybe someone's husband or father. And I ended all of that in 5 seconds because I'd been trained better than he had. The weight of that has gotten heavier as I've aged, not lighter. When I was young and still in the war, then young and trying to build a life after the war, I could push it aside, focus on other things, tell myself it was necessary, which it was. But now, at the end of my life, with most of my time already spent, those moments come back. The faces I can still remember, the faces I've forgotten, the ones who died by my hand directly, and the ones who died because of artillery I called in, or decisions I made or actions I took. All of it comes back, and I have to make peace with it before I run out of time to do so. Patton didn't prepare us for that part. He prepared us to win, to survive, to be professional soldiers who could do the hard things that war required. But he didn't prepare us for living with what we'd done, for carrying those memories for 70, 80 years, for facing ourselves in the mirror when we're 92 and wondering if we're still the same person who killed those men or if we've become someone different. Maybe that wasn't his job. Maybe his job was just to win the war and let us figure out the rest on our own. Or maybe there's no way to prepare for that. Maybe it's something every soldier has to work through alone. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The piece of paper with 17 names. I wonder sometimes if those men struggled with similar questions. If they felt guilty about being relieved, about not measuring up to Patton's standards. If they felt like failures even though most of them probably did fine in whatever assignments they got after being transferred. Or if they were relieved, grateful to be away from Patton's demanding command, happy to serve somewhere less intense. I don't know. Never stayed in touch with any of them. After the war, we all went our separate ways, and that was that. But I think about them because they're part of this story too. Patton's 10 days weren't just about the men who stayed and met the standards. They were also about the men who were cut from the team, who were deemed not good enough or not fixable in the time available. Those 17 names represent everyone who got left behind when Patton rebuilt the army. And that's a loss too, even if it was necessary. Those were experienced soldiers in most cases. Men who'd served their country, who'd done their best, who just couldn't meet Patton's impossible standards in the time given. Their stories matter too, even if history mostly forgot them. War is full of forgotten stories. Men who did extraordinary things that no one recorded. Men who failed in ways no one remembers. Men who were just there, doing their jobs, surviving or not surviving, and then fading into history without recognition. I'm lucky that I'm still here to tell my story. Lucky that I survived the war, survived the decades after, made it to 92, with my mind still mostly intact, and my memories still mostly reliable. Most men don't get that chance. Most stories die with the men who live them. So I'm telling mine, not because I think I'm special, but because I can. Because someone should remember Patton's 10 days from a soldier's perspective, not just a general's or historian's. The smell of gun oil and cosmoline. That's what I remember most physically from those 10 days. We were cleaning weapons constantly, and the smell just soaked into everything. Your uniform, your skin, your gear. You couldn't escape it. Even now, if I smell gun oil, I'm back in Morocco. Back in that tent with my rifle disassembled on a blanket, checking every part, cleaning every surface, making sure it would work when I needed it to. The smell triggers the memory more powerfully than photographs or stories or anything else. Smell goes straight to the brain somehow, bypasses all the filters, drops you right back into the moment. I taught my son to clean a rifle when he was 16, bought a .22 and taught him properly. How to field strip it, how to clean each part, how to reassemble it correctly, how to check that everything worked. He asked why we had to be so thorough for a .22 that we'd only use for target shooting. I told him it wasn't about the rifle. It was about learning to do things right. Learning that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing well. Learning standards. He rolled his eyes like teenagers do, but he learned. And years later, he told me that lesson stuck with him. That whenever he faces something difficult now, he thinks about cleaning that rifle with his old man and learning to meet a standard that seemed excessive but wasn't. That's Patton's legacy in my life, I guess. Not just military tactics or discipline under fire, but the broader principle that standards matter. That excellence isn't optional. that you can't half-ass things that matter and expect good results. Whether it's combat or raising kids or building a career or maintaining a marriage or anything else worth doing, you have to commit to doing it right. That was Patton's message, stripped of all the military context. Do it right or don't do it at all. And if you think you can't do it right, you're probably wrong. You probably can if you're willing to work hard enough and accept no excuses from yourself. The German tank commander at Guettar, the one I mentioned before, Kurt something. I read in that history book that he survived the war, went home to Germany, lived a long life. I wonder if he told stories about North Africa, about fighting the Americans, about how we'd improved so dramatically between Kasserine and Guettar. I wonder if he understood what had happened, that an American general had rebuilt a broken army in 10 days, or if he just knew that something had changed and the Americans were suddenly much more dangerous than before. I wonder if he killed any of my friends, if his tank took out any of our boys, if he carried memories like I carry memories, if he woke up at 80 or 90 years old thinking about the Americans he'd killed and wondering what their names were and if they'd had families waiting for them. Probably. War does that to everyone who really fights in it. The ones who come out unchanged weren't really there, weren't really in it. The ones who were there carry it forever. There's a photograph from sometime after Guettar. I don't remember exactly when it was taken, maybe in Sicily, maybe back in Morocco between campaigns. Shows a group of us standing in front of a half-track. I'm on the left side, skinny kid with an M1 rifle slung over my shoulder. Can't be more than 21 in the photo, look about 16. But if you look close at the faces in that photograph, we all look older than our years. Something in the eyes, something in how we stand. We'd been through things that aged you in ways that had nothing to do with time. I showed that photograph to my grandson once. He was maybe 12. He looked at it and said, "We all look sad." I told him we weren't sad, we were serious. There's a difference. We knew what we were doing was important. Knew men had died so we could stand there for that photograph. Knew more men would die before it was over. That kind of knowledge changes how you hold yourself, how you look at the camera. You're not sad exactly. You're just aware of the weight of things in a way most people never are. Patton appears in some photographs from that period. Always immaculate. Perfect uniform, perfect posture, those ivory-handled pistols gleaming. He looked like a general out of central casting. Everything about his appearance was calculated to project strength, confidence, authority. We understood that was part of his leadership too. The way he presented himself mattered. When you saw Patton, you saw someone who was in complete control, who knew exactly what he was doing, who would tolerate no weakness or failure. That appearance reinforced everything else he did, made his standards seem less arbitrary and more inevitable. Of course you had to keep your uniform perfect. The general did. Of course you had to maintain your equipment immaculately. Patton did. He led by example in that way, even if his example was sometimes impossible for normal soldiers to fully match. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I met a German veteran once. This was in the 1980s. Veterans Conference in Washington, D.C. They'd invited German veterans to attend, part of the whole reconciliation thing. This old man, had to be in his 70s, came up to me and saw my North Africa campaign ribbon and we started talking. Turned out he'd been with the Africa Corps, might have been at Guettar for all I know. We talked for maybe an hour, about the desert, about the heat, about how both our armies had struggled with supply lines and disease, and the sheer difficulty of fighting in that environment. At one point he asked about American leadership, asked if it was true that American generals were less experienced than German generals at the start of the war. I told him yes, that was true. We were learning as we went. He nodded and said they could tell. Said Kasserine had been easy because we'd made basic mistakes. But then something changed, he said. The Americans got much better very quickly. I told him about Patton, about the 10 days, about how one general had transformed an entire corps through sheer force of will and uncompromising standards. The German veteran thought about that for a minute and then said, Patton must have been like some of their officers. Ruthless, but effective. Feared, but respected. I agreed that was accurate. We shook hands before parting. Two old men who'd tried to kill each other's countrymen 40 years before, meeting as peers decades later. It was strange, but also somehow right. The war was over. We'd both survived. We'd both lived long enough to see our countries become allies instead of enemies. And we could acknowledge that both sides had produced brave men, skilled soldiers, leaders who did what they thought necessary. Patton would probably have hated that. He didn't believe in respecting the enemy. He believed in crushing them. But Patton died young, didn't live long enough to get old and reflective and complicated like I did. The thing about living to 92 is you outlive simple narratives. When you're young, everything is clear. Your side is good, their side is bad, your cause is just, their cause is evil. That clarity helps you fight, helps you kill without doubt. But when you live long enough, when you meet the enemy decades later and realize they were just men like you following orders like you, when you see that history is more complicated than the stories told during wartime, that clarity fades. You're left with something messier, something harder to explain. You did what you had to do and it was right at the time, but it's complicated now, and maybe it always was complicated, but you couldn't afford to see it that way then. Patton never had to face that complexity. He died in December 1945, just months after the war ended. Car accident in Germany, gone at 60 years old. He died still a warrior, still convinced of the righteousness of the cause, still certain about enemies and allies. Part of me envies that. Part of me is glad I've had these extra years to think things through, to see things from different angles, to try to make sense of what we did and why, and whether it mattered the way we thought it did. It did matter. I'm certain of that at least. Defeating Nazi Germany mattered. Stopping the Holocaust mattered. Liberating Europe mattered. Those weren't complicated questions. The cause was just. But the individual acts within that just cause, those are more complicated. Did that specific German soldier I killed need to die? Yes. In the moment, it was him or me. But in the larger sense, did it matter whether he lived or died? He was one soldier in a massive war. Would the outcome have been different if I'd missed? If he'd killed me instead? Probably not. The Allies would have won anyway. So what did it mean, that death? What did any of the individual deaths mean when the outcome was determined by massive forces beyond any individual's control? I don't have answers. Just questions that have gotten louder as I've gotten older. Maybe that's the real cost of war. Not just the men who die, but the ones who live and spend the rest of their lives trying to understand what they did and why. Patton saved us from some of that by making us professionals, by teaching us to think of war as a job that required skill and discipline rather than as some moral crusade. That helped. Made it easier to do hard things without drowning in the morality of every act. But it didn't eliminate the questions, just postponed them until later, until now, until I'm 92 and running out of time to find answers. The 17 names on the piece of paper. I've come back to that image over and over in this story because it represents something important. It represents the price of transformation. Those men paid a price so the rest of us could become better soldiers. Maybe they would have died at the next battle if they'd stayed with us. Maybe Patton saved their lives by transferring them out. Or maybe they would have risen to the occasion, would have met the standards given more time, and Patton robbed them of that chance. I don't know. All I know is that transformation requires sacrifice, and sometimes the people who sacrifice aren't the ones who get to enjoy the benefits of the change. That bothers me more now than it did then. At 20, I accepted it as necessary. At 92, I wonder about those 17 men, about what they felt when they saw their names on that paper, about whether they understood why Patton did what he did, about whether they forgave him or cursed him for the rest of their lives, about whether their families knew why they got transferred or demoted, about all the ripple effects of Patton's decisions that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. Leadership is heavy that way. When you make decisions that affect other people's lives, you carry those decisions forever. Patton made decisions that affected thousands of men, decisions that saved some and destroyed others, decisions that were right strategically but devastating personally. And he made them without hesitation because he believed the mission mattered more than individual comfort or individual careers. That's what made him effective. That's also what made him controversial. And it's what makes him complicated to evaluate all these years later. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I'm 92 years old, and I've been talking for a long time now, telling you about 10 days in Morocco that happened 79 years ago. 10 days that changed everything for me and for the army I served in. 10 days that were harsh and exhausting and transformative. 10 days that I've carried with me through nearly 8 decades of life, through everything that came after the war, through all the moments when I had to decide what kind of person I wanted to be and what standards I wanted to hold myself to. Those 10 days taught me that broken things can be fixed, that defeat doesn't have to be permanent, that with leadership and discipline and uncompromising dedication to excellence, transformation is possible. They taught me that sometimes love means being hard on people because being soft gets them killed. They taught me that standards matter, that doing things right matters, that professionalism matters even when it's difficult. They taught me that I was capable of more than I thought, that most people are capable of more than they think, and that the difference between potential and achievement is usually just someone demanding that you live up to your potential. I don't know if Patton would be proud of how I've told this story. Probably not. He'd probably think I was too soft, too questioning, too willing to see complexity where he saw only clarity. He'd probably tell me to stop overthinking it, that we had a job to do and we did it and that's all that matters. And maybe he'd be right. Maybe I am overthinking it. Maybe the simple version is the true version. We were beaten, Patton rebuilt us, we won, the end. But I'm 92 and I've earned the right to complicate things if I want to. I've earned the right to remember not just the glory, but the cost. Not just the victories, but the sacrifices. Not just what we gained, but what we lost along the way. And what we lost was innocence and youth, and the belief that war was simple or noble or anything other than hard and complicated and necessary and terrible all at once. The piece of paper with 17 names. I still see it when I close my eyes. Still remember standing there in the Moroccan dust, reading those names, and understanding that my world had changed. That the army I'd joined, the army that lost at Kasserine, was gone. That Patton was building something new, and we were either going to be part of it, or we were going to be cut. That there was no middle ground, no coasting, no good enough, only excellence or failure, only standards met or standards missed, only transformation or elimination. I chose transformation. Or maybe transformation chose me. Maybe I just got lucky, happened to have the skills or the temperament or the stubbornness to meet Patton's standards where others couldn't. I don't claim any special virtue. I just know that I survived those 10 days, survived the war, survived the decades after, and made it to 92 with these memories intact. And now I'm sharing them because someone should know what it was really like. Not the sanitized version, not the heroic myth, but the messy, complicated, difficult reality of being a young soldier in a defeated army that got rebuilt by a ruthless general in 10 brutal days. Was it worth it? Did Patton's methods justify the cost? Would we have been better off with a gentler approach, more time, less pressure? I don't know. I can't know. All I can say is that we went from defeat to victory, from broken to functional, from scared boys to professional soldiers in 10 days. And that transformation, whatever its cost, saved lives, including mine. So yes, I guess it was worth it. Even though it hurt, even though men paid prices they shouldn't have had to pay, even though the harshness felt excessive at the time and still feels excessive in memory. It was worth it because we survived and the alternative was not surviving. That's the calculus of war reduced to its simplest form. Survival versus non-survival. Everything else is secondary. Patton understood that, made every decision based on that understanding, and because he understood it so clearly, because he never wavered or compromised or accepted anything less than what was necessary for survival, we survived. Most of us anyway. More than would have survived without him. I'm 92 years old, and I'm near the end of this story, just like I'm near the end of my life. Both have gone on longer than I expected. Both have been more complicated than I hoped. Both have forced me to grapple with hard questions that don't have easy answers. But I wouldn't have missed either one. Wouldn't have missed the war, despite its horrors, because it shaped me into who I became. Wouldn't have missed these 92 years, despite their difficulties, because I got to live a full life that many men from my generation didn't get to live. The piece of paper with 17 names. One last time. I see it in my mind even now, even as I finish this story, even as I prepare to close out these memories and move on to whatever time I have left. That paper represents a moment of decision, a fork in the road, a choice between staying broken or becoming whole. Patton forced that choice on all of us. Some of us made it through, some didn't. But we all faced it. We all had to decide whether we'd meet the standards or accept the consequences of failure. I met the standards, barely sometimes, but I met them, and that has made all the difference. Patton's 10 days weren't just about military tactics or combat readiness. They were about learning what you're capable of when someone refuses to accept your excuses, When someone demands more than you think you can give. When someone believes you can be better and won't let you settle for less. That lesson has served me for nearly 80 years, has gotten me through hard times, has made me a better father, a better husband, a better man than I would have been without it. So thank you, General Patton, even though you're long dead and will never hear these words. Even though you were harsh and demanding and sometimes cruel. Even though you broke men's careers and pride to build the army you needed. Thank you for not accepting defeat. Thank you for demanding excellence. Thank you for showing me what I was capable of. Thank you for those 10 brutal, transformative days in Morocco that I've carried with me for 79 years and will carry to my grave. I'm Henry Lawson. I'm 92 years old. I went through Patton's 10 days and survived the war and lived a life, and now I'm at the end of that life, looking back and trying to make sense of it all. And if there's one thing I want people to understand from this story, it's that transformation is possible, that broken things can be fixed, that standards matter, that discipline, real discipline, is a gift rather than a burden, that sometimes the hard path is the right path, even when it doesn't feel that way in the moment. That's what Patton taught me. That's what those 10 days were really about. And that's what I'll carry with me into whatever comes next. The memory of standing in the Moroccan dust, reading 17 names on a piece of paper, and understanding that everything had changed, that we were being rebuilt, that we were becoming something better than what we'd been, that we were being given a chance to redeem ourselves, to prove ourselves, to transform ourselves from defeated soldiers into warriors who could win. We took that chance. We met the standards. We transformed. And because we did, we survived. That's the story. That's what happened. That's what I remember after all these years. Patton's 10 days. The time a ruthless general rebuilt a broken army and changed my life forever. I was there. I lived it. And now you know what it was like. Thank you for listening to an old man's memories. I hope they matter. I hope they're not forgotten. I hope someone, somewhere, learned something from what I went through all those years ago. The piece of paper with 17 names. I still see it. I'll see it until I die. And that's okay. Some memories are supposed to last forever. Some moments are supposed to stay with you. Some transformations are supposed to mark you permanently. Patton's 10 days did all of that. And I wouldn't change it even if I could, because it made me who I am. And who I am, for better or worse, is someone who survived and lived and made it to 92 with these stories to tell. That's enough. That has to be enough. It's all I have to give.